Hi, this is Ibarionex from the Candid Frame. A while back, I got a message from one of the contributors to our Flickr group and a listener to the show. And he wrote a message about wondering about, well, let me read you the email. So this is from Gary Chow, and he wrote, Ibarionex, when professional photographers critique photos, they often dismiss those that they are unimpressed with by referring to them as snapshots. Yet when I see many of these photos you feature on your videos, and I have seen a number of your videos today, and I enjoy them, thank you, I wonder whether they are simply snapshots too. I know you make a lot of to do about them and imbue them with qualities that the taker may not even have thought of, but how do you differentiate between a snapshot and one that is of a higher quality? I'm not sure what is a snapshot and what is not in the minds of the pro shooter, but I assume a snapshot is one taken with little thought in mind. That is, there is no setting up, no consideration for light and compositional rules, no time to take in framing the photo, accidental. And that's really sort of an interesting idea because there's I think behind a lot of photographs, it's the big question is intentionality. You know, how intentional was the photographer in creating this composition, and how much just amounts to just luck, to just happenstance, to just pressing the button at the right moment and making a good photograph. And when I take a look at a lot of the photographs that get submitted to the Flickr group, I'm not really trying to figure out, well, is this a snapshot or is this an intentionally good shot? But let's take a look at some of these pictures that will help me sort of riff a little more on this whole idea. Here we have a shot by Selene 1968, shot with an iPhone 4S at 1/3700th of a second at f2.4 ISO 50. Now, you take a look at this shot, and immediately you get a sense that this is more than a snapshot because of the way it's so well composed. It has a really wonderful balance between the two opposing men in the frame, the one on the left and the one on the right. You have the presence of the dog, you have the barge or the boat in the distance, you even have the shadow on the ground. All of these elements relate to each other, even though in real life they may have not had a direct relationship with each other other than the man in the foreground and the dog. The relationship is implied by the way the photographer framed the scene. And so this shot is definitely not a snapshot because of the intent of the photographer. I think when you think of snapshots, you typically will see a photograph where there's something in that scene that draws the viewer's attention. But the photographer at that point just raises to the camera and presses the button, and they're not necessarily seeing. They're seeing their subject and they're raising the camera because they want to document it. But there's no intentionality in terms of the framing, in terms of the composition, in terms of considering the relationship of all those various elements that are within the frame. More often than not, these kinds of shots include a whole bunch of business that has nothing to do with what drew the photographer's attention in the very first place, and that kind of image becomes busy. It becomes a snapshot. You know, the photographer has to point out, oh, it was this thing that sort of drew my attention, and only after the fact do they realize that there was all this other stuff, all this other crap in the frame that really diminishes the ability of that composition to be a good photograph. So when I'm taking a look at a lot of the pictures that get contributed to the Flickr group, I'm not so much looking for shots that I think were done professionally, quote unquote. I'm looking for shots that hint to me that there was some sort of intention. And one of the easiest ways of being able to discern that sort of intention is by composition. But not necessarily all images have to be as well composed as this one. It's not always as clearly evident that there may have been some intent. All right, next we have this picture by Eric Castro, shot with a Samsung NX300M at 1/320th of a second, f8, ISO 1600. Okay, this is a very different shot from the other one, which was very serene and calm, and the photographer had great control over what was happening within the frame. Here we have the absolute opposite of that. We have a chaotic scene in Times Square in New York We have all these people here that seem to be taking pictures of their own reflections over this sort of glass surface. We see them with their camera phones. I'm not sure exactly where we are here, where they're maybe Trump Tower or something like that. Who knows? But anyway, despite all this sort of busyness that's happening in the background, where do you look? You look at the mother and the child that we see primarily in the right-hand corner, and which is reflected in the mirrored surface on the left. Despite all this craziness and all this busyness, we know where our eyes should fall. And I think that's also part of what elevates a photograph beyond being a snapshot. It's do we as viewers know where we are supposed to be looking? And with a snapshot, there's usually so much stuff in the frame. Your eye usually sort of wanders around the frame, looking at this, looking at that, and whatever the photographer of a snapshot was intending or what they were reacting to, it's not clearly obvious. Sometimes they have to say, well, hey, yeah, I saw this thing here and this is what I was responding to. But as a photographer, you're going, well, why didn't you pay attention to what was behind them or off to the left or all these other distractions that minimize the impact of the image? The photographer is only looking at that one thing in the frame. Even after they've taken the shot, they only look at that one thing in the frame and going, that's what I was trying to get a picture of. But if you want to make a photograph, you're making a photograph of something, but that something is not the photograph. Your photograph is that image, that thing that you end up seeing on the screen or you see on that piece of paper. And at that point, you have complete responsibility for everything in that frame. Because if a person looks at your photograph and doesn't have the benefit of you standing next to them explaining what you intended, all they have is the photograph. That's all they have to look at, to respond to, and react to. So that's why images can communicate so much, because if the photographer is really on top of it, they can express in the photograph what they felt at the moment that they made the picture and evoke that reaction. At least that's what I'm trying to do. And in this shot, that connection between mother and child really touches me. It really resonates with me, especially in the midst of all this chaos, because the way the boy is clutching the jacket, the look on his face, the way the mother seems to be pushing her way through this crowd of people who are taking pictures with their smartphones, evokes an emotional reaction to me, largely because I remember being that young and, having to move through crowds with my father and my mother and wanting to be protected. And I get that from that shot. And if you look at this picture, there's a lot of stuff that's happening in the background. You have all these people, you have the signage, you have all this stuff that's happening here. Yet our eyes keep falling on the mother and the child. So even though this image is not as clean and as sparse as the previous image, you know where your eye is supposed to fall. And I think that that's part of the story about whether or not your pictures are more than snapshots. Here's a shot by Daniel Hermes, shot with a Sony ILCE7 at 1250th of a second. No f-stop information, ISO 100. Okay, so here's a scene that a lot of people, I think, would almost automatically write off as a snapshot, because it's an alleyway and it's a building and there's some interesting graffiti on the wall. But if you look at it more carefully, you realize that Daniel here seemed to be very conscious of not just the mural, but also everything he was choosing to include in the frame and how he included it in the frame. If you look at it just in terms of a graphic point of view, you see all these vertical lines, all these horizontal lines, all these diagonal lines, and there's an interplay of all those shapes that happen throughout the photograph that sort of repeat themselves and reinforces it just based on a compositional level. Yes, the anchor of this shot is the painting of the glasses and the eyes and the orange dumpster there. I mean, those are very strong visual draws in that image, right? So he may have been responding to that, but when I look at this composition, I feel like he was paying attention to the entire frame. I think, and this is sort of the trick, because we're constantly out there with our cameras, whether they are our smartphones or whether they are our DSLRs or mirrorless cameras, and we'll see something like this. We'll see this graffiti on the wall. We'll see the orange dumpster, and we'll just make a shot of that, and we'll work. We may take 2 or 3 shots, but how about all the other stuff that was in the frame? Does that play a role in the shot? It's still about the glasses and the dumpster. The shot is still about those 2 things, but these other things, these I assume are apartment buildings. They're playing a role in this shot. They may not be as important as those 2 elements near to the bottom of the frame, but they're playing a role in the overall composition. And I think Daniel does a real effective job in terms of his framing to make sure that those things that are in the background don't detract from what's happening in the foreground. That's the kind of careful seeing that I want to encourage people to do when they go out and shoot. And the only way you can do this is by slowing down. I've mentioned this in other videos, that people are often so much in a rush, and they'll make a snap and they're moving on to the next thing. And they're not really carefully evaluating not only what's in front of their eyes, but what they're doing with the camera in order to capture it. And I think if you slow down and really carefully assess everything that's in the frame, you can do that. Even with a crazy street scene like the previous shot, there's a way of sort of anticipating moments like this. For me, I might see this crowd, I might see the reflection there, and this woman and this child might pass by, and as sort of a real split-second reaction, I could make the shot. But more than likely, and what I usually do, is I'll see the potential for a moment like this, and I'll just camp out and I'll just make picture after picture after picture, waiting for the right moment, the right person, the right character, the right gesture to help complete the shot. And I don't know what the story is here. We don't know unless Eric, at some point decides to leave a message here at the bottom, which I welcome that you do, because I'd be really curious as to how, what led up to this photograph. But whether it's happening in a split second or whether you have a leisure amount of time like you would have with this scene, it's all about, ownership. It's about deciding that, everything that I'm seeing in this frame either belongs in the shot or doesn't, and making a choice to either include it or exclude it. And I think that is definitely what elevates something beyond being a snapshot. Now here we have a shot by Gary Radler. We have no information here on the equipment. So here's a real common scene, right? Kids at the beach, they're playing at the beach. And here's this shot with shot looks like a fairly wide angle lens. So we have a lot of the sand, the looks like tide pools, the clouds, the horizon line, and the kids here in the right-hand corner. Is this a snapshot? Is this a more intentionally composed photograph? It could be either one, couldn't it? This could be a moment that was just sort of snapped, and the person, Gary, may have just been sort of lucky to have a beautiful day with beautiful elements within the frame, or he could have been a little more intentional about it. And I get the feeling he was a little more intentional about it, just because of the placement of the kids within the frame. There's a rainbow that's barely visible in the middle of the frame. Might that have been what he was photographing, and it just so happens that the kids, were there in the frame? Because imagine this shot without the kids, and the shot isn't as effective anymore. It's just sort of it's basically a snapshot, because you have all these elements that are, fairly well balanced within the frame, especially having those great clouds, and you have that rainbow. But you can imagine someone saying, "Oh, I see this rainbow," and making a photograph, and not being really conscious about everything else that's in the frame. But by having those 2 kids in the frame, all of a sudden they become a critical component of this overall composition. They elevate the shot from being more than just sort of a landscape of this scene with this barely visible rainbow in the background. But again, it's about, what was Gary's ultimate intent in this photograph? Was he conscious of the presence of the kids? Were they a big part of the shot, or was he reacting to that rainbow in the distance? Or did the initial thing that draw him was the rainbow, and then it just so happens that those kids were in the frame, and he just got lucky, right? It could be any variety of things. But what I'm challenging you to do is that when you're out there making photographs, becoming conscious, waking yourself up to what potential really lies with any scene that you're drawn to that you want to photograph. If you don't want snapshots, then you have to wake up and you have to be conscious of what's happening in that frame. Because otherwise you're just dependent on luck and happenstance to give you a good photograph. I think the only thing that really differentiates a really great photographer from an average photographer or even a poor photographer is the consistency. Is how consistent can you make yourself? Can you train yourself to be? And I think it's very, very possible, but it begins with slowing down and taking ownership of that frame. So I hope you like that. If you're finding us for the first time and you've never heard of the Candid Frame, well, the Candid Frame is a photography podcast in which I interview photographers about their work, about their careers, about personal projects, about books they're releasing. I just interviewed a photographer from Brazil, Andre Penteado, who did an amazing series that was inspired by the death of his father, who died from suicide. And it's an amazing story about how a photographer takes probably one of the most painful things that we can ever experience, and translates that into art. And you can listen to it by going to the Candid Frame and just streaming it. It's also available on iTunes and a lot of podcast apps. But we do have an app available for both Windows, Android, and Apple iOS that you can download for free. That gives you complete access to the archive of all of our interviews, over 344 interviews, and more coming. So check it out. And if you want to contribute images to our Flickr pool, all you need to do is just go to Flickr, search on the Candid Frame, and just ask to be added. You'll probably have to do it via your computer rather than your tablet or your phone, because I get messages from people who say that it's invitation only. It's not. All you have to do is just go use your computer and ask to be added, and I'll be more than glad to do it. So thanks again for joining me, and I'll see you next time.